class learned today. That's sort of like saying first book printed with movable metal type in Western Europe. But nonetheless, the Library of Congress remains the world's largest library, and there are many features of our existence which is derived directly from the experience of Mr. Jefferson's collection, and that's what we'll be talking about tonight. At the moment, the Library of Congress numbers it somewhere around 160 to 180 million pieces, and we're cataloging at the moment in 452 languages. So as you can imagine, it's a rather vast and extraordinary landscape that I live in. The story of the Library of Congress, of course, begins with Mr. Jefferson. Washington was scorched. The blazing of houses, ships, and stores, the report of exploding magazines, and the crash of falling roofs informed them of what was going forward. You can conceive of nothing finer than the sight which met them as they drew near the town. This is how George Gleig, who's a member of the English forces advancing on Washington City in 1812, describes the destruction and the invasion of Washington City. The sky was brilliantly illuminated by the different conflagrations, and a dark red light was thrown upon the road, sufficient to permit each man 50 miles away to view distinctly his comrade's face. Heaps of smoking ruins. Well, it's an evening that many of us can experience here, both in Charlottesville as well as in Washington, a hot, muggy August day, August 24th, 1814. An exhausted advance guard of English troops approached Capitol Hill. They had arrived by ship some 50 miles away, along with 4,000 troops, including Mr. Gleig, about the day before, and found themselves now in an abandoned city of Washington, all the men having fled to Georgetown. Those of us who live in Washington, D.C., whenever there's important legislation, understand this phenomenon. Men fleeing to Georgetown, leaving the women to guard those buildings that protected children. Meeting only limited resistance, the troops set about their appointed task, which was to destroy every public building in Washington. In retaliation, and this is the part of the story we never tell in Washington, in retaliation for the destruction of the city of York, or Toronto, in 1813 by American forces. By the time they finished, the White House, the Capitol, the Treasury, the Arsenal, and almost every other conceivable public building in Washington had been destroyed. Many of them literally smoking ruins, nothing left standing. The English Admiral Cockburn, who was jeeringly referred to as the ruffian by the National Intelligence or newspaper, the DC newspaper at the time, capped the devastation of Washington by ordering that this newspaper office be destroyed brick by brick. And in addition, demanded that the letters C's from all the type drawers be removed and smelted in front of him so they could never again print the name Cockburn and take his name in vain. But nevertheless, amidst all the rubble and the smoke and the ruins, the Capitol, and more importantly, the Congressional Library, was completely destroyed, smoldered, and disappeared. The nucleus of the Library of Congress obviously then is forged in fire. In 1815, Congress purchased Thomas Jefferson's personal library, then the largest private collection held in North America, to replace the 3,000-volume Congressional Library that was destroyed by the British when they burned the Capitol, and there's the burning of the Capitol for you. Although he faced financial difficulties at the time, Jefferson generously offered to sell his entire collection for whatever price found appropriate by Congress, with the intention to simply replace the devastations of British vandalism that occurred when the English had invaded Washington City. Jefferson's gesture, as of course you would expect Congress, whenever there's a moment of generosity extended, met with one and only one thing: rank partisan debate that lasted for months. One Federalist opponent, Cyrus King of Massachusetts, and at this point Massachusetts goes up quite a ways, almost to Maine, claimed that the library was symbolic of Mr. Jefferson's infidel philosophy. Mr. Jefferson's library, he warned Congress, contained the good, the bad, the indifferent, the old, the new, the worthless, in languages which many cannot read and most ought not. Others objected to the cost that was impending for the purchase of this library, because after all, the price that was being discussed could actually outfit and house 210 regular enlisted soldiers. In anticipation of this kind of debate, Jefferson managed to write a letter in 1814 that served as his countering to these kinds of charges, and it's a phrase that's forever repeated at the Library of Congress. There is, in fact, no subject to which a member of Congress may not have occasion to refer. The congressional decision took months. In the end, the members acquiesced, and in January of 1815 voted to purchase the 6,487 volumes for nearly $24,000, which is a real steal by any accounting. The sum, in fact, was determined by a Georgetown book dealer, Joseph Milligan, who, after facing the daunting task of appraising Mr. Jefferson's collection, finally arrived at a very sensible formula of simply saying $1 for every 12 mo, 3 for every octavo, 6 for every quarto, and 10 for folios. He called it a day. With that decision, the nation's library was restored. Jefferson received word for the approval while at Monticello, where he happened to be entertaining two young gentlemen from Boston, George Ticknor and Francis Gray, young scholars who came with introductions from John Adams. They were paying a visit to the president and, more importantly, to his library. And they had the great fortune to actually witness this moment in which Thomas Jefferson understands that his collection will now become the National Library. Both, of course, were doing what many had done, seeking out the intellectual counsel and reading advice from one of the great minds of the American Enlightenment in the midst of his great library. By 1815, Thomas Jefferson's library was in itself a destination. The sheer size of well over 6,000 volumes was a sight to behold. Certainly in colonial America it was, and certainly even in the early 19th century. Mr. Ticknor, who was a Dartmouth graduate, soon after, almost immediately, frankly, was retained by Jefferson to go acquire books abroad. In other words, no sooner has he learned that his entire collection has been sold to the American government than he turns around and asks the graduate students standing there watching the event, "I understand you're going to Europe," he says. "Would you mind picking up a few books for me?" Jefferson later wrote to Adams describing Ticknor as particularly the best bibliograph I've ever met. Mr. Gray, who was also present, and later life goes on to become a connoisseur of fine prints. He's also the recipient of a very odd letter, an awkward letter that becomes quite famous, in which Jefferson tries to explain away his position on slavery by redefining categories of enslavement. Mr. Gray felt later in life to comment on the moment and agreed that Mr. Jefferson's library was extremely comprehensive, as he describes, especially in regards to the classical authors, although he noted Mr. Jefferson was very careless in his editions. His American holdings, he said, however, were the most and finest, unquestionably, in the world. During his lifetime, Jefferson actually assembled not one, but four really, if you count Forest Home, but three libraries. The first private library burned when Shadwell destroyed his family home in 1770, and only a few books escaped the flames. Fire, in fact, seems to follow Jefferson. Fire and debt, actually, seem to follow Jefferson in his books. And that is, in fact, the story of his libraries and that going on. In spite of the disruptions of a pending revolution and the obvious cost of rebuilding the Shadwell Library beginning in 1770, the 26-year-old lawyer set out to build an even more extensive collection, one that would modestly encompass, as he described, the whole of recorded knowledge.